When pharmaceutical giant Meridian Health settled 6 opioid lawsuits for over $400 million, the media called it justice. But attorney Mike knew something the world didn't. Trial 7 was different. In a small-town courtroom in Pennsylvania, a widowed mother named Callie Rhodes refused to settle. Her husband, a construction worker with a back injury, had become one of 50,000 overdose deaths that year after doctors prescribed him what they called safe pain relief. Meridian's defense had never lost at trial. Their strategy was bulletproof. Blame the patients, not the pills. They had unlimited resources, expert witnesses who rewrote medical history, and a legal playbook designed to exhaust any plaintiff who dared to fight. But Mike's small firm discovered something buried in 14 million pages of internal documents, a single email that would expose a conspiracy so calculated, so ruthless, it would change how America understood the opioid crisis forever. This is Trial 7. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The conference room was sparse, just a table, 2 chairs, and a recording device humming quietly between them. Mike leaned back, his shirt sleeve rolled up to his elbows, the kind of tired that comes from years of fighting battles most people never hear about. The interviewer across from him adjusted the microphone and asked the question everyone wanted answered. So when Callie Rhodes walked into your office in 2019, did you know this would become Trial 7? Mike shook his head slowly. No. Honestly, I thought she'd take the settlement like the others. Meridian Health was offering her $8 million. For a widow raising 2 kids on a teacher's salary, that's life-changing money, but she didn't take it. She didn't take it. Mike confirmed, a slight smile crossing his face. She sat in my office, looked me dead in the eye, and said, I don't want their money, I want the truth on record. That's when I knew we were going to trial. The interviewer leaned forward. Walk me through what made this case different from the 6 settlements before it. Mike stood up and walked to the window, his hands in his pockets. The first 6 cases, we had sympathetic plaintiffs. Good people whose lives were destroyed by oxymeridian, the painkiller Meridian Health, marketed as non-addictive. We had medical records, we had death certificates, we had grieving families. But Meridian's defense team, led by their lead counsel, Victor Malone, had a strategy that worked every single time. Blame the victim. Exactly, Mike said, turning back. They'd put the deceased on trial. They'd find every mistake that person ever made. A DUI from 20 years ago, a fight in high school, marijuana use in college. They'd paint a picture of someone who was predisposed to addiction, someone who would have ended up there anyway. And juries, they'd see reasonable doubt. They'd think, maybe it wasn't just the pills. The interviewer nodded, making notes. So why settle the first 6? Mike returned to his seat. Because Victor Malone is the best defense attorney money can buy. He's never lost a pharmaceutical liability case, not once in 37 trials. His firm had unlimited resources. They could outspend us 100 to 1. They could drag cases out for years, burying us in motions and depositions until plaintiffs gave up or went broke. The settlements were strategic. Take the money, sign the NDA, move on. But Callie's husband, what was his name? Derek Rhodes. Mike's voice softened. Construction foreman. Threw his back out on a job site in 2016. Doctor prescribed oxymeridian, told him it was safer than ibuprofen. Within 6 months, Derek was taking 10 pills a day. Within a year, he lost his job. Within 18 months, he was buying pills off the street because his prescription ran out. 22 months after that first prescription, Callie found him unresponsive in their garage. The room went quiet for a moment. The interviewer let the silence sit before continuing. What made you think you could win against Victor Malone when 6 other firms couldn't? Mike pulled out a folder from his briefcase, old and worn at the edges. In 2018, during discovery for Trial 4, Meridian Health was ordered to turn over internal documents. We're talking about 14 million pages. Most law firms, they'd hire a team of junior associates to review that stuff. We couldn't afford that. So I did something desperate. What did you do? I called in a favor from an old law school friend, Matthew Moore. He'd left practice to become a data analyst. I asked him if there was a way to search 14 million pages for patterns, keywords, anything that might give us an edge. The interviewer raised an eyebrow. And he found something. Mike opened the folder and slid a single printed email across the table. He found this. Buried in page 9,847,562 of the document production, an internal email from March 2012, 7 years before we went to trial. The interviewer picked up the page, scanning it quickly. What am I looking at? That's an email from Meridian's chief medical officer to Victor Malone and 3 senior executives. Read the subject line. Oxymeridian addiction study, strategy for litigation exposure. The interviewer looked up. This is attorney-client communication. That's what Meridian claimed when we tried to use it in Trial 5. The judge agreed, ruled it was privileged, kept it out of evidence. But here's the thing about that email, Mike said, pointing to a specific paragraph. It references an attachment, a study, but the attachment wasn't in the production. They withheld evidence. Mike smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That's what we needed to prove. And that's why Callie Rhodes was different. She wasn't fighting for money. She was fighting for discovery. She wanted to force Meridian to produce that study. The interviewer set the email down. Did they produce it? That, Mike said, standing up again, is where Trial 7 gets interesting, because 3 weeks before jury selection, Matthew Moore found something else. Something that proved Meridian Health didn't just know oxymeridian was addictive, they knew it was killing people. And they had a plan to make sure no one ever found out. The interviewer waited, but Mike walked toward the door. We'll pick this up tomorrow. There's someone I need you to meet first. Who? Mike turned back, his hand on the doorframe. The Meridian Health employee who sent that email. The one who's been in witness protection for the last 4 years because of what she knows. The next morning, the interviewer arrived at a different location, a small office in a building with no signage. Mike was already there, sitting across from a woman in her mid-50s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked nervous, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long gone cold. This is Josie Warren, Mike said by way of introduction, former director of clinical research at Meridian Health. Josie, this is the documentary team I told you about. Josie nodded but didn't extend her hand. I've told this story to lawyers, to federal investigators, to journalists who never published a word. Why should I trust you're any different? The interviewer sat down carefully. Because Mike says Trial 7 changed everything. I want to understand how. Josie looked at Mike, who gave her an encouraging nod. She took a deep breath and began. I started at Meridian in 2009. I was hired to oversee clinical trials for oxymeridian before it went to market. The drug was supposed to be revolutionary, a pain reliever that didn't carry the addiction risk of traditional opioids. That's what they told us. That's what we believed. When did you realize it wasn't true? The interviewer asked. 2011, Josie said flatly. We were running phase 3 trials, the final stage before FDA approval. I started seeing red flags in the data. Patients were escalating doses faster than predicted. Some were showing signs of physical dependence within weeks. I brought it to my supervisor. What happened? I was told the data was inconclusive, that we needed larger sample sizes. That pain management always involved some level of tolerance building. So I ran more studies, and the results were worse. By March 2012, I had documented evidence that 23% of patients in our trials showed signs of addiction within 6 months. Mike interjected. Tell them about the meeting. Josie's hands tightened around her cup. I was called into a conference room. Victor Malone was there. He wasn't our lawyer yet, but Meridian had him on retainer as a consultant. There were 3 executives, including the CEO at the time. I presented my findings. I recommended we halt the FDA approval process and reformulate the drug. How did they respond? Victor Malone asked me one question. If this data becomes public, what's our litigation exposure? Not, how do we fix the drug? Not, how do we protect patients? Just what will it cost us in lawsuits? The interviewer glanced at Mike, who remained stone-faced. What did you say? I told him the truth. If we released oxymeridian knowing it was addictive and people died, we could face liability in the billions. Wrongful death suite, class actions, criminal charge, And Josie's voice dropped. Victor Malone stood up, thanked me for my presentation, and said, "Then we'll need to make sure this study never sees the light of day." He turned to the CEO and said, "Bury it." Attorney-client privilege. If it doesn't exist in discovery, it can't hurt us. The room went silent. The interviewer processed what they just heard. They destroyed evidence? Worse, Mike said. They classified Josie's study as part of a legal strategy memo, made it attorney work product. That way, even if someone requested it in discovery, they could claim privilege and refuse to turn it over. That's legal? It's a gray area that corporations exploit constantly, Mike said. But here's where they made a mistake. Josie kept a copy. Quick pause. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Josie reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive. I knew what they were doing was wrong. I couldn't prove it then, but I kept my raw data, all of it. When Derek Rhodes died and I read about the lawsuit, I contacted Mike. The interviewer stared at the USB drive. This is the study they suppressed. This is the study that proves Meridian Health knew oxymeridian was addictive 3 years before it hit the market, Mike said. This is the study that shows they projected 50,000 deaths over 10 years and decided the profit margin was worth it. This is the smoking gun. Why didn't you use it in the earlier trials? Mike and Josie exchanged a glance. Because Victor Malone knew Josie had it. He filed a motion to exclude her as a witness in trials 1 through 6, claiming she violated her employment contract by retaining company property. The judges agreed. We couldn't put her on the stand. So how did you get it admitted in trial 7? Mike smiled for the first time all morning because in trial 7, we didn't call Josie as a witness. We called someone Victor Malone never saw coming, someone who had access to the exact same data through a completely different channel, someone Meridian Health thought they'd silenced years ago. The interviewer leaned forward. Who? Mike stood up, checking his watch. Her deposition is in an hour. You should be there to see what happens when Victor Malone realizes his perfect defense strategy just collapsed. The deposition room was bigger than expected, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Pittsburgh. A court reporter sat ready at her machine, and a videographer adjusted his camera angle. Victor Malone entered first, a tall man in his early 60s with silver hair and a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never lost, and he barely acknowledged Mike's presence as he took his seat. The interviewer sat in the back corner with Mike, notebooks ready, camera crew positioned discreetly. They whispered to Mike as they waited. Who are we waiting for? Luna Stevens, Mike said quietly, former FDA reviewer who evaluated oxymeridian's approval application in 2013. The FDA approved a drug they knew was addictive. That's what we're about to find out. The door opened and a woman in her 40s entered, her expression nervous but determined. She wore a simple blazer and carried a folder thick with documents. She sat across from Victor Malone, who barely looked up from his notes. The lead attorney from Meridian, a younger associate named Wesley Ford, started the questioning with standard preliminaries. Name, occupation, relationship to the case. Luna answered each question carefully, her voice steady despite her obvious anxiety. Then Wesley shifted gears. Ms. Stevens, you worked as an FDA medical reviewer from 2011 to 2015, correct? That's correct. And you were part of the team that reviewed Meridian Health's application for oxymeridian approval. I was. Can you describe the approval process? Luna took a breath. When a pharmaceutical company applies for FDA approval, they submit clinical trial data, safety studies, efficacy reports. Our job is to review everything and determine if the drug's benefits outweigh its risks. And in your professional opinion, did oxymeridian's benefits outweigh its risks? Luna paused, and the interviewer noticed Victor Malone finally look up from his notes, his eyes narrowing slightly. Based on the data Meridian submitted, yes. The clinical trials showed effective pain relief with minimal addiction risk. That's what we approved. Wesley smiled, thinking he'd scored a point. So the FDA, using the best available data, determined oxymeridian was safe. We determined it was safe based on the data we received, Luna clarified, but we didn't receive all the data. The room temperature seemed to drop. Wesley glanced at Victor Malone, who remained perfectly still. What do you mean you didn't receive all the data? In 2015, 2 years after approval, I was reviewing post-market surveillance reports. Doctors were reporting higher than expected addiction rates. I started digging through our files, comparing what we'd approved versus what was happening in the real world. That's when I noticed something odd, which was Meridian's Phase 3 trial data showed addiction rates of less than 3%. But their own internal projected models, which I found referenced in a footnote of a secondary document, suggested rates closer to 23%. I started asking questions about where that 23% number came from. Wesley's confidence faltered. And what did you discover? I discovered there was a clinical study that Meridian conducted but never submitted to the FDA, a study that showed significantly higher addiction potential. When I inquired about it through official channels, I was told the study was classified as attorney work product and wasn't required for submission. Victor Malone finally spoke, his voice smooth and controlled. Ms. Stevens, are you aware that companies are not required to submit every internal memo or preliminary analysis to the FDA? They're required to submit completed clinical trials that meet scientific standards. Luna turned to face him directly. I'm aware of what's required, Mr. Malone. I'm also aware that withholding material safety data from federal regulators, even under the guise of legal privilege, is a violation of FDA regulations. That's a serious accusation, Victor said, his tone hardening. Do you have proof that Meridian deliberately withheld required data? I have proof that the data existed. I have proof that it was never submitted. And I have proof that Meridian knew about the addiction risks years before approval. Mike leaned forward in his seat, and the interviewer noticed a slight smile cross his face. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. Wesley tried to regain control. Ms. Stevens, you left the FDA in 2015, correct? Under somewhat controversial circumstances? Luna's expression tightened. I resigned after my superiors told me to stop investigating Meridian Health. I was informed that pursuing the matter further would be, quote, career limiting. So you left because you were told to stop making unfounded accusations? I left because I realized the agency wasn't interested in the truth. They were interested in protecting pharmaceutical companies that fund their operations through user fees. Victor Malone stood up abruptly. I'm going to stop this deposition right here. Miss Stevens is clearly biased against my client and is using this proceeding to air personal grievances about her former employer. Nothing she's testified to is admissible, and frankly, this is a waste of everyone's time. Mike stood as well, and the interviewer watched the two attorneys face each other across the table. Sit down, Victor, we're not done. Yes, we are. You brought in a disgruntled former federal employee with an axe to grind. The judge will never allow this testimony. The judge will allow it, Mike said calmly, because Luna isn't just here to testify about what she found at the FDA. She's here to testify about what happened after she left. Victor Malone went very still. What are you talking about? Mike turned to Luna. Tell them about Ashton Bishop. Luna opened her folder and pulled out a series of printed emails. After I resigned from the FDA, I was contacted by a whistleblower inside Meridian Health. Someone who had access to the suppressed clinical study. Someone who wanted to make sure the truth came out. And who was this whistleblower? Wesley asked, his voice uncertain. Ashton Bishop. He was a senior research analyst in Meridian's clinical trials division. He'd worked on the oxymeridian studies from the beginning. In 2016, he reached out to me through an encrypted email service. He said he couldn't live with what the company had done. He said people were dying and Meridian was covering it up. Did he provide you with documents? He provided me with everything. The raw trial data, the internal memos, the communications between Meridian executives and legal counsel. He gave me the complete picture of how they suppressed the addiction study and manipulated the FDA approval process. Victor Malone's face had gone pale. This is hearsay. You can't introduce documents from an unnamed source who isn't here to authenticate them. He's not unnamed, Mike said. His name is Ashton Bishop, and he's listed as a witness for Trial 7. He'll authenticate every single document. Then where is he? Victor demanded. Why isn't he sitting here instead of this woman? Luna's voice dropped. Because 3 weeks after he sent me those documents, Ashton Bishop disappeared. The room went silent except for the hum of the videographer's camera. The interviewer felt their pulse quicken. What do you mean disappeared? I mean, he stopped responding to emails. His phone was disconnected. When I tried to reach out through mutual contacts, they said he'd left Meridian suddenly and no one knew where he'd gone. It was like he vanished. Did you report this to authorities? I reported it to everyone. The FBI, the Justice Department, local police in his hometown, no one could find him. No one seemed particularly interested in looking. Mike pulled out his phone and brought up a news article, sliding it across the table. Until 6 months ago, when a hiker in Western Virginia found human remains in a ravine off Highway 81. Dental records confirmed the identity last month. The interviewer read the headline, "Missing Pharmaceutical Researcher Found Dead, Ruled Accidental Fall." Victor Malone's composure finally cracked. "You're not seriously suggesting my client had something to do with this man's death? That's not just inappropriate, it's actionable defamation." "I'm not suggesting anything," Mike said. "I'm stating facts. Ashton Bishop had evidence that would destroy your client. He disappeared before he could testify, and now he's dead. Those are facts." "Correlation is not causation," Victor shot back. "People have accidents. This is a desperate attempt to poison the jury pool with conspiracy theories." "Maybe," Mike agreed, "but here's what's not a theory. Ashton Bishop sent Luna those documents before he disappeared. Luna has had them for 6 years, and in Trial 7, we're going to present every single page to the jury." Victor grabbed his briefcase. "Then I'll file a motion to exclude them. They're not properly authenticated, they're prejudicial, and they're irrelevant to Derek Rhodes' death." "File whatever motions you want," Mike said. "But there's one more thing you should know before you leave." Victor paused at the door, his hand on the handle. Ashton Bishop wasn't working alone. There's a second whistleblower. Someone still inside Meridian Health. Someone who's been documenting everything your company has done since Ashton disappeared. Someone who's been waiting for the right moment to come forward. The color drained from Victor Malone's face. "Who?" Mike smiled. "That's what we're going to find out in court." "See, at trial, Victor, 3 weeks had passed since the deposition." The interviewer returned to Mike's office to find it transformed into a war room. Boxes of documents lined every wall. A whiteboard covered in timelines and connections dominated one side, and evidence markers were scattered across a conference table that looked like it hadn't been cleared in days. Mike was standing at the whiteboard, marker in hand, drawing lines between names. He looked like he hadn't slept properly in a week. "Victor Malone filed 17 motions to suppress evidence," Mike said without turning around. 17. He's trying to exclude Luna's testimony, Josie's study, Ashton Bishop's documents, even Callie's own medical expert. He's throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. The interviewer set down their equipment and took in the controlled chaos of the room. "Is it working?" The judge denied 14 of them. "We're still fighting over the other 3, but we got what we needed. Luna can testify. The documents are admissible." And most importantly, Mike turned around and there was fire in his eyes. The second whistleblower has agreed to testify. "Who is it?" Mike walked to the table and picked up a deposition transcript, thick as a phone book. "Her name is Kendall Harper. She's been Meridian Health Senior Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for the last 8 years. She reports directly to the CEO. She has access to everything." The interviewer felt their pulse quicken. "Why would someone in her position turn on the company?" "Because she has a daughter," Mike said quietly. "A daughter who became addicted to oxymeridian after a car accident. A daughter who's been in and out of rehab 3 times. A daughter who almost died from an overdose last year. That's when she reached out to you? That's when she realized she'd spent 8 years helping Meridian cover up the same crisis that destroyed her own family. She couldn't live with it anymore." Mike handed over the transcript, and the interviewer flipped through pages of testimony that read like a corporate thriller. Kendall had documented everything: internal emails discussing litigation strategy, meetings where executives calculated acceptable death tolls versus profit margins, and most damning, a systematic effort to identify and silence potential whistleblowers. "This is incredible," the interviewer said, still reading. "She kept records of everything?" She's a lawyer herself, former prosecutor. She knew exactly what she needed to build a case. She's been copying files for 2 years, waiting for the right moment. Why now? Why Trial 7? Mike sat down heavily in his chair, the exhaustion finally showing. Because after Ashton Bishop died, Meridian implemented something they called the Sentinel Protocol. It's an internal surveillance program designed to identify employees who might leak information. They monitor emails, track document access, flag anyone who shows patterns of unusual data requests. Kendall realized she was under suspicion. They knew she was gathering evidence. They suspected. About 6 months ago, she was called into a meeting with Victor Malone and the CEO. They didn't accuse her directly, but they made it clear that anyone found leaking proprietary information would face criminal prosecution, civil liability, and according to Victor's exact words, quote, consequences beyond the courtroom. The interviewer looked up sharply. That sounds like a threat. That's exactly what it was. Kendall left that meeting terrified. She knew what happened to Ashton. She knew Meridian had the resources and the ruthlessness to protect their interests by any means necessary. So she contacted me through an intermediary, a journalist friend who'd been investigating pharmaceutical companies for years. We spent 3 months planning how to protect her while still using her testimony. How do you protect a witness from a multi-billion-dollar corporation? Mike stood and walked to a locked filing cabinet, pulling out a thick folder marked Witness Security Protocol. We don't have the resources the federal government has, but we got creative. First, we moved Kendall and her family to an undisclosed location. Then we transferred copies of all her evidence to 3 separate secure servers in different states. We brought in a private security firm, former Secret Service agents who specialize in corporate whistleblower protection. And most importantly, we went public. You announced she was going to testify, not officially, but we leaked it to the right people. Major newspapers, investigative journalists, legal bloggers. We made sure that if anything happened to Kendall Harper, the entire world would know who to blame. It's called the spotlight defense. You can't silence someone if everyone's watching. The interviewer processed this, understanding the stakes for the first time. You think Meridian would actually harm her? Mike's expression hardened. I think a company that suppressed evidence of 50,000 deaths to protect their profit margin is capable of anything. I think a company that made Ashton Bishop disappear wouldn't hesitate to do it again. And I think Victor Malone knows exactly what his client is capable of, which is why he's fighting so hard to keep Kendall off the stand. Has she been threatened? Not directly. But 2 weeks ago, her daughter, the one who survived the overdose, received a package at her rehab facility. Inside was a bottle of oxymeridian and a note that said, some habits are hard to break. No return address, no signature, no way to trace it. The interviewer felt a chill. Did you report it to police? We reported it everywhere. Police, FBI, state attorneys general. You know what they said? Insufficient evidence to pursue an investigation. Could have been a coincidence, could have been a sick joke from someone who read about the case online, but Kendall knows the truth. We all do. So how do you keep her safe during the trial? That's the interesting part, Mike said, pulling up a document on his laptop. Victor Malone filed a motion to exclude Kendall's testimony, claiming she's a disgruntled employee with a personal vendetta. He argued that her daughter's addiction makes her biased, that her testimony would be prejudicial rather than probative. He wanted her barred from the courtroom entirely. Let me guess, the judge denied it. The judge did better than that. Judge Tessa McCarthy, she's seen enough pharmaceutical cases to know when a company is hiding something. She not only denied Victor's motion, she issued a protective order. Any attempt to intimidate, threaten, or contact Kendall Harper or her family members would result in immediate sanctions, potential criminal charges, and an adverse inference instruction to the jury. The interviewer smiled. So if anything happens to Kendall, the jury gets told to assume Meridian is guilty? Exactly. Victor Malone walked out of that hearing looking like he'd been punched in the stomach. For the first time in his career, he couldn't control the narrative. He couldn't make the witness go away. And he realized that trial 7 wasn't going to be like the others. When does the trial start? Mike checked his watch. Jury selection begins in 4 days, opening statements in 6. We've got 127 documents marked as evidence, 19 witnesses lined up, and a trial strategy that Victor Malone has never seen before. What makes your strategy different? Mike walked back to the whiteboard and pointed to the timeline he'd drawn. Every trial before this, we played defense. Meridian would put our plaintiffs on trial, attack their character, question their choices, make them prove they were perfect victims who deserved justice. We spent so much time defending our clients that we never got to prosecute Meridian. That changes in Trial 7. How? Because we're not going to defend Derrick Rhodes. We're going to put Meridian itself on trial. We're going to show jury every document, every email, every internal memo that proves Meridian knew exactly what their drug would do. We're going to walk them through the timeline from Josie's 2012 study to Ashton Bishop's 2016 whistleblowing to Kendall's 2023 evidence. We're going to make Victor Malone defend the indefensible. The interviewer leaned back, impressed by the scope of what Mike was attempting. That's a massive undertaking. What if the jury doesn't follow it? What if they get lost in the details? That's where Callie comes in, Mike said softly. She's not just the plaintiff in this case. She's the moral center of the entire trial. Every piece of evidence, every witness testimony, every legal argument comes back to one simple question. Could Derrick Rhodes have been saved if Meridian had told the truth? And your answer? My answer is that Derrick Rhodes is one of 50,000 people who died because a pharmaceutical company decided profit was more important than human life. My answer is that Callie Rhodes deserves to hear Meridian executives admit under oath that they knew and they didn't care. My answer is that Trial 7 isn't just about one family's justice. It's about holding an entire industry accountable for the opioid crisis they created. The room fell silent. The weight of what Mike was carrying, the responsibility of representing not just Callie, but thousands of families destroyed by Meridian hung in the air. Finally, the interviewer asked the question that had been building since the beginning. Do you think you can win? Mike looked at the whiteboard, at the evidence boxes, at the deposition transcripts. 6 months ago, I would have said no. Victor Malone has never lost. Meridian has unlimited resources. The system is designed to protect companies like them. But now, with Josie's study, Luna's testimony, Ashton's documents, and Kendall willing to expose everything from the inside, I think we have a chance, a real chance. And if you lose, Mike's expression darkened. If we lose, Victor Malone will use Trial 7 as a blueprint for defeating every future opioid case. He'll show other pharmaceutical companies exactly how to suppress evidence, silence whistleblowers, and walk away clean. Meridian will keep selling Meridian, people will keep dying, and the message will be clear. Corporations are untouchable. That's a lot of pressure. That's why we can't lose, Mike said firmly. That's why Callie refused to settle. That's why Kendall is risking everything to testify. That's why we spent 2 years preparing for 6 days in court. The interviewer started to ask another question, but Mike's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, and his face went white. What is it? Mike read the message twice, then looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. Victor Malone just filed an emergency motion. He's asking for a mistrial before we even start. On what grounds? Mike handed over his phone. The motion claimed that Mike had violated attorney ethics rules by publicly discussing the case, that Kendall Harper's testimony was obtained through improper means, and most shocking, that Mike had fabricated evidence to frame Meridian Health. This is insane, the interviewer said. Can he do this? He can try. The judge scheduled an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning. If she grants this motion, Trial 7 is over before it begins. Everything we've worked for, everything Callie's been fighting for, gone. What are you going to do? Mike grabbed his coat and briefcase. I'm going to spend the next 16 hours preparing to prove that Victor Malone is so desperate to protect his client that he's willing to destroy the integrity of the entire legal system. And then I'm going to show Judge McCarthy exactly what happens when you back a small-town lawyer into a corner. The emergency hearing lasted 4 hours. When Mike finally emerged from the courthouse, the interviewer was waiting on the steps with the camera crew. His expression was unreadable. What happened? Mike loosened his tie and sat down on the concrete steps, exhaustion written across his face. Judge McCarthy denied Victor's motion. She called it a transparent attempt to derail a legitimate trial and said if he filed one more frivolous motion, she'd sanction him personally. So Trial 7 is moving forward. Jury selection starts tomorrow morning. The interviewer sat beside him. Then why do you look like you just lost? Mike pulled out his phone and showed a news alert. The headline read, Meridian Health announces $2 billion settlement fund for opioid victims. The article detailed a massive proposed settlement that would compensate thousands of families affected by oxymeridian, with payments starting immediately. They're trying to buy their way out, the interviewer said, understanding immediately. Make Trial 7 irrelevant. Worse than that, they're betting that when the jury hears about this settlement, they'll think Meridian is taking responsibility. Victor will paint them as a company trying to make things right, and he'll make us look like greedy lawyers refusing reasonable compensation. What did Callie say? Mike's phone buzzed with a text. He read it aloud. I didn't come this far to let them write the ending. See you in court. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Media filled the gallery, sketch artists positioned themselves strategically, and a line of people hoping for public seats wrapped around the building. The interviewer and crew were given press credentials, cameras positioned to capture every moment. Callie Rhodes sat at the plaintiff's table beside Mike wearing a simple navy dress, her hands folded in her lap. Across the aisle, Victor Malone commanded a team of 6 attorneys, all in matching dark suits, all reviewing last-minute notes with mechanical precision. Judge McCarthy entered, and the bailiff called the court to order. The jury selected over 2 grueling days, filed in 8 women, 4 men, a mix of ages and backgrounds, all looking nervous about the responsibility they'd been given. Mike stood for his opening statement. He didn't use notes. He walked to the jury box and spoke directly to them. Derek Rhodes was 38 years old when he died. He was a construction foreman, a husband, a father of 2. He coached his daughter's soccer team and taught his son to fish. He paid his taxes, volunteered at his church, and never broke the law. And he died alone in his garage with a needle in his arm because a pharmaceutical company lied. The jurors leaned forward. Mike had their attention. Over the next week, you're going to hear Meridian Health's lawyers tell you that Derek made choices, that addiction is complicated, that you can't blame one company for a national crisis. And they're right about one thing: addiction is complicated. But this case isn't. This case is about a simple question. Did Meridian Health know oxymeridian was killing people, and did they hide that information to protect their profits? Mike walked back to his table and picked up a document. This is an internal email from 2012. Meridian's own chief medical officer wrote, "Our studies show addiction rates of 23%, but if we disclose this, litigation exposure could reach tens of billions." They knew, and they buried it. He placed the email on the projector, and it appeared on screens throughout the courtroom. Several jurors took notes. You're going to meet Josie Warren, who ran those studies. You're going to meet Luna Stevens, who tried to stop FDA approval. You're going to meet Kendall Harper, who watched this company choose money over human life for 8 years. And when you've heard all the evidence, I'm going to ask you to do something simple. Tell the truth. Tell Meridian Health that 50,000 deaths matter. Tell them that Derek Rhodes' life mattered. Tell them that justice isn't for sale. Mike sat down. The courtroom was silent. Victor Malone stood for his opening, smooth and polished. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a tragedy. Derek Rhodes' death is a tragedy. But tragedy doesn't equal liability. My client didn't prescribe oxymeridian to Mr. Rhodes. His doctor did. My client didn't tell Mr. Rhodes to take more than prescribed. He made that choice. My client didn't force Mr. Rhodes to buy illegal pills on the street. He did that himself. The defense strategy was clear: blame everyone except Meridian. The trial moved quickly. Josie testified about the suppressed study, her voice shaking but resolute. Luna described the FDA approval process and the data that was withheld. Medical experts explained how oxymeridian's chemical structure was designed to be addictive. Callie took the stand and told the jury about finding Derek's body, about telling their children their father was never coming home. Then on day 4, Kendall Harper testified. The interviewer watched from the press section as Kendall walked to the witness stand, her hands trembling slightly. Victor Malone's team looked tense, knowing what was coming. Under Mike's questioning, Kendall methodically detailed 8 years of corporate malfeasance. She described meetings where executives laughed about acceptable losses. She read emails where Victor Malone coached Meridian on how to structure documents to avoid discovery. She explained the Sentinel protocol and how the company tracked potential whistleblowers. Did you ever hear executives discuss Ashton Bishop? Mike asked. Yes. After he disappeared, the CEO said in a management meeting, "That's what happens when people forget where their loyalties lie." It was a warning to the rest of us. Victor Malone objected repeatedly, but Judge McCarthy overruled him each time. The jury was riveted. On cross-examination, Victor tried to break Kendall's credibility. "Miss Harper, isn't it true you were passed over for a promotion last year?" "Yes." "And you blame the company?" "No, I blame myself for staying silent while people died." Victor's carefully constructed attack collapsed. He sat down 15 minutes into his cross-examination, something the interviewer had never seen a lawyer do. Closing arguments came on day 6. Mike spoke last. "Victor Malone told you this case is about personal responsibility." He's right, it is. It's about Meridian Health taking responsibility for 50,000 deaths. It's about executives who chose profit over people taking responsibility for that choice. It's about a legal system that either holds corporations accountable or becomes complicit in their crimes. He paused, looking at each juror. "Derek Rhodes can't speak for himself, but you can speak for him. Your verdict will tell the world whether his life mattered, whether any of our lives matter when weighed against corporate profits. I trust you'll make the right choice." The jury deliberated for 11 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and read the verdict. "We find in favor of the plaintiff, Callie Rhodes. We award compensatory damages in the amount of $43 million. We award punitive damages in the amount of $1.2 billion. The courtroom erupted. Callie collapsed into Mike's arms, sobbing. The interviewer captured every moment as Victor Malone gathered his papers in stunned silence and left without speaking to the press. Outside the courthouse, Mike gave a brief statement. "This verdict sends a message. No company is too big to be held accountable. Trial 7 wasn't just about one family. It was about changing the rules. And today we did." 2 weeks later, the interviewer met Mike one final time in his office. The boxes were gone, the whiteboard clean, but new files were already stacking up on his desk. "What happens now?" Mike smiled, tired but satisfied. "Now the real work begins. 17 law firms have contacted me asking for our trial strategy. Kendall's testimony opened the floodgates. Federal prosecutors announced a criminal investigation into Meridian. And Callie, she's started a foundation to help other families fight back. And Victor Malone, Victor announced his retirement last week. 37 years undefeated until trial 7. The interviewer packed up their equipment. One last question, was it worth it? All the risk, all the pressure, everything you put on the line? Mike looked at a photo on his desk. Callie and her children at Derek's grave holding a newspaper with the verdict headline, "Every single second." Retry up next. 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoy this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click